There's a lot of complexity surrounding the Israeli invasion of Gaza, the Israeli siege of Gaza. One aspect is whether or not this is a genocide, and and whether or not it's a concentration camp, whether or not Israel has been guilty of keeping the Palestinians, the Gazans, in a concentration camp. These tropes are certainly present on the internet and in public discourse. Well, Gaza certainly was a very strange concentration camp, if it was one, because it had shopping malls, it had universities, and so on. So that's not clear-cut. Neither is it clear-cut to say that the siege of Gaza has been a genocide, or that Israel is involved in a genocide. Genocide is a term which is used quite randomly and loosely, and depending on which side of the argument you're on, depends on how voraciously, how vociferously you embrace that terminology. Genocide involves the willing destruction of a people. It's also used to describe the catastrophic attack on a people and the experience that they have of this brutality of an attack. So is the siege of Gaza brutal? Absolutely. Is it deeply necessary? I don't think so. Is it a war crime? I think there are war crimes involved. But is it genocidal? I'm not so convinced about that. And has Israel always been genocidal towards Palestine? I'm certainly not convinced about that either. People want to see a straight line through from 1948 to the present day. Again, that isn't straightforward. And in fact, given the fact that the population in Gaza has risen significantly since Hamas took control in the early part of the 21st century, it would be extraordinary to claim that Israel was intent on genocide. Rather than reducing the Palestinians, it's seen them increase. But is the siege of Gaza genocidal? And there you have to ask about the role of Netanyahu and his government. So the problem for somebody standing on the edge in a different country, like I am, in the UK, looking on and observing, is there isn't a single tribal loyalty to call on. And the simplicity which is demanded of social media simply isn't available. So I would fall back on the same sort of comments that I've made repeatedly, that Netanyahu is utterly repulsive, and the people who are aiding and abetting Netanyahu to keep him in power are utterly repulsive and are almost certainly guilty of war crimes and must stand trial to find out, how guilty they are, whether they can be held to account. But they must certainly explain their actions publicly, and they must account for the horrors that have been inflicted on the Palestinian people. That's point one. Point two, I actually don't think that the siege of Gaza has been remotely efficacious in eradicating the Palestinian atrocity, the terrorist atrocity that was visited on Israel on October the 7th. If anything, it has done more to drive the recruitment of future terrorists. It has bred hatred, and it has bred opposition. And a good leader of his country which Netanyahu is not. Netanyahu couldn't keep his people safe on October the 7th. A good leader of his country would have sought peace with the neighbours. Instead, Netanyahu is seeing the eruption of war on almost every side. And his only approach is to continue hammering on at Gaza. Now, the other thing which I think is worth pointing out is the atrocities of Hamas. Because Hamas oppresses its own as much as it oppresses Israel. In the same way, you don't see people protesting against Russia, against Putin. They wouldn't dare. They would end up in prison or out of a window. So too in Hamas and in Hamas-controlled Gaza. They wouldn't dare. So that is no sign of the validity of the Hamas government in Gaza, that no one was opposing it. This is a group of people that got into power and have not gone to the ballot box since, have not tested their power. This is a dictatorship, a tyranny. And it needs to be resisted as much as the tyranny of Putin. So if there is a parallel between the Israeli-Gaza situation and the Israeli and the Russian-Ukrainian situation, it's not that Ukraine is like Gaza. It's that Russia is like Gaza. It's that Russia is oppressive in the same way as Gaza is oppressive, or that the Kremlin is oppressive in the same way that Hamas is oppressive. And it's in Israel and it's in Ukraine that you see some element of democracy. Not in Gaza and not in Russia. And it strikes me as extraordinary that people on the streets are so determined to see a tribal simplicity that they don't recognize the complexity of the two systems. The complexity of living in Russia, the complexity of living in Gaza, the complexity even, of course, of living under Netanyahu's regime in Israel. I think, however, the document that's been published and built exclusively on Friday is very interesting because it makes it quite clear that Yahya Sinwar's this document was found on his computer. It makes it quite clear that he is determined to be in this for the long run and is determined to intentionally abuse hostages to leverage his negotiating position. And that is a disturbing reality. It instructs people to continue to exert psychological pressure on families of the hostages, both now and during the first phase of the ceasefire, so that public pressure on the enemy government increases. And the psychological tactics against the hostages' family is a strategy developed to increase pressure on Israel to agree to the terms of any deal. During the negotiations for the second phase of the ceasefire, Hamas will allow the Red Cross to visit some of the prisoners as a gesture of goodwill and to convey messages to their relatives. They don't want a quick end of the war. Rather, the document says important clauses in the deal should be improved on, even if negotiations continue over a longer period of time. The Hamas says that its military capacity has been weakened, but it doesn't see the need to end the fighting quickly. It wants to rebuild power. It wants to engineer a political maneuver that Arab forces be stationed along the eastern and the northern borders with Israel and serving as a buffer to prevent the enemy from entering Gaza after the war ends until they, Hamas, have reorganized the ranks and military capabilities. It says that Hamas is determined that Israel should be held solely responsible for any unsuccessful negotiations. The media must be aware that Hamas agreed, but that the deal failed to Israel's stubbornness. Hamas should not be held responsible for the failure of an agreement. It is crucial. It's very strange. It wasn't in the document. The German press has said it. It was very strange. The document makes no reference to the Philadelphia corridor, despite it being one of the key sticking points. In other words, it lends credibility to the idea that maybe a lot of these sticking points, a lot of these concerns, are simply nonsense to prolong the negotiating period so that the hostage families get more and more frustrated with Israel. But it is not helped. So we know that the Hamas terrorists, we know that they are playing a dark game. But it's not helped by the fact that so is Netanyahu. And this document that links Hamas, that links Hamas, that is linked to Hamas, and that shows these plans to intensify its operations, including the tunnel warfare, including the guerrilla tactics, including the idea of a prolonged conflict with Israel. It's and the idea that the escalations between Hamas and Israel, the difficulties in negotiation are all calculated on the Hamas side as well as the Israeli side. That, I think, is an extraordinary discovery, and I don't think it's simply a matter of pure chance. I've got a random cat who's turned up in my house, and I have no idea why he's here. But the ongoing siege, the fact that it's raised issues about genocide, I think that's very interesting as well. If you compare the Israeli siege with the Armenian genocide, for example, there are similarities and distinctions. Like the Armenian genocide, the siege of Gaza is characterized by large-scale civilian suffering, displacement and deaths. But defenders of Israel's actions argue that they're responding to Hamas, a terrorist organization, which complicates comparisons to the Armenian genocide, a state-led campaign against civilians without an armed resistance context. Opponents argue that regardless of the justification, the systematic destruction of a population, including targeting civilians, meets the criteria for genocide, even when framed as a military operation or response to terrorism. And I think that's something that one needs to consider, no matter how justified Israel's response to an appalling atrocity on October the 7th, no matter how shocking is Sinwar's documentation as revealed, nothing quite justifies the collective punishment and the sheer scope of civilian deaths that have been taking place in Gaza at the hands of the Israeli government. Nothing justifies that. Particularly when the real objective of getting back the hostages is nowhere nearer being complete. We're getting up to the point where this will have been a year since the invasion, since the terrorist attack. A year. And the hostages are still incarcerated. And now we're told that a directive has gone out that if if the Israeli troops get anywhere near a group of hostages, they should be killed. It's heartless, it's brutal, it's deeply wrong. But I think there should be absolute standards that we should against which we should judge this story. Absolute standards. And collective punishment is wrong. And after so many years, these people, these civilians, can't stand up to the Hamas government, whether they elected them or not. I think one particular story breeds another, and the story about a possible genocide also breeds the idea of this long-term Israeli persecution and the concentration camp ideas, which I think are significantly less credible. And this is really the problem, that on the internet and on YouTube, it's assumed you're on one team or on the other, that you're following one particular group or the other, that you're all out for this particular group. I'm afraid I'm not.